of all, I'm John Letman. I'm the chair of the the Town of Rockingham Historic Preservation Commission, also of the small but still enthusiastic Rockingham Meetinghouse Association. And it's wonderful to welcome Bill Hosley for the, I don't know how many time since we first welcomed you. Bill was the speaker at the Rockingham Meetinghouse annual pilgrimage for the bicentennial year of the Meetinghouse in 1987. Rockingham Town Historic Preservation Commission joins in partnership with the Rockingham Free Public Library in sponsoring this evening's event. Bill, we're talking about the need for ongoing restoration and conservation of the cemetery. Is never going to stop being a concern. William Hosley is an independent scholar who has written extensively about New England graveyards, including the Rockingham Cemetery. He's a graduate of Middlebury College, also of Vermont Academy, and the Winter Tour program, an early American culture, photographer, preservationist who specializes in cultural resource development. He has worked for the Vermont Division for Historic Preservation. This series is made possible through funding from the Vermont Division for Historic Preservation and the National Park Service. So, Bill, let's move along.
Hey, great. Welcome those who have tuned in. And this is being recorded, so I suspect it'll have an afterlife on social media and other places. And let's take a look at a place I love.
Greetings, I'm Bill Hosley, and welcome to Where Art and History Meet, Rockingham Meetinghouse Burying Ground. As a historian and longtime museum curator, my interest in gravestone studies was always multidimensional. There are so many aspects of looking and learning in these veritable museums without walls. In the winter of 2020, at the beginning of the pandemic, my wife and I had just retired. Museums closed everywhere. We began visiting graveyards and cemeteries, lots of them, hundreds of them, and took thousands of photographs. You can see me up there on a ladder. 2020, we published an article in Antiques and Fine Arts magazine about our pandemic adventures. My first publication was about the Rockingham stonecutters in 1978. In the 80s and 90s, I oversaw a project at Hartford's ancient burying ground that raised $1 million for restoration work. Wrote a book about it. Over the years, Christine and I have given tours of cemeteries in Connecticut, Vermont, and Western Mass. I first stumbled into this half a century ago as a student at Vermont Academy. In those years leading up to the bicentennial, interest in local history and historic preservation were soaring. Less than 4 miles away, I could cycle to Rockingham Meetinghouse in half an hour, and it's still one of my favorite roads in Vermont. Even the town seal in Rockingham acknowledges the importance of this national historic landmark. I attended my first Rockingham pilgrimage in 1976 when famous artist, writer Eric Sloan was the speaker. Now a college student, in 1975, a friend and I did a winter term project, spent a week photographing all around Rockingham and mounted an exhibit there. Civic stewardship, making sense of place, it's all about taking stock of the cultural assets that make places special and different. And Bellows Falls in particular is loaded with them. A wonderful architecture, outstanding houses in historic streets, and monuments. An outstanding visitor center, and a historical society with huge potential and a new place to show their growing collections. A gem of a local museum in Saxon's River. Local art and artists, mural art, Algonquin Indian history and artifacts, historic mill sites, agriculture, waterfalls shown in Brockway Mills and Gageville, and of course the Connecticut and Williams rivers. The story of Gravestone cutting in the Connecticut Valley begins in the south in Connecticut, where the brownstone is the leading material. And a lot of the stonecutters that worked in brownstone, anyway, made their way to Vermont, which was settled a little bit later. Gershom Bartlett, the most famous of those, moved from Connecticut to Norwich, Vermont in 1771, and his work appears as far south as Walpole and as far north as Haverhill, New Hampshire, and several towns in Vermont. History lessons. Days in a classroom cannot compare with what students could get sitting around fascinating artifacts with an engaging teacher. Unforgettable. The thousands of stories with a little research that students can do themselves. We can unpack amazing layers of history. Stones of Reverend Timothy Edwards and his wife, Esther Stoddard Edwards. Her father was the most prominent clergyman in Western New England, and their son, Edwards, became the most famous clergyman of the Great Awakening and an internationally renowned figure in his lifetime. Pretty amazing. And then the sad story of Israel Seymour, Redware Potter from Hartford, who was killed instantly by lightning when he was standing in the front door of his house during a storm. That's grist for a Sunday sermon, I'm sure. And then the sad and poignant story of Harriet Loomis, missionary to Africa, up in Newbury, Vermont. Again, gravestones are filled with stories that they tell. So what do we got here in Rockingham? I'd been poking around this site for years and counted among the most evocative historic sites in Vermont, a national treasure, easier to appreciate the more you look and learn. While the Burying Ground is a veritable art gallery with work by dozens of stonecutters and sculptors, one stands out more than most. Moses Wright Jr., his father, Captain Moses Wright, was one of the founders and first settlers of Rockingham. Rarely, but occasionally, they signed their work, as in this example. And then these are two stones by Moses Wright and Solomon Wright that Rubbings made of them in Chester and in Rockingham that are both signed. Captain John Roundy's stone by Moses Wright has been featured in books and magazines. The stark simplicity of the moon-faced soul effigy is genius-level folk art. No one has ever seen a more emotionally charged image of such simplicity. Roundy served as a captain in the American Revolution and held many town offices and was the captain of the town militia. If Moses Wright repeated this formula over and over, as some stonecutters did, it might get dull. Astonishingly, he only did this version of the moon face one time. But look at these others. It's the perfect example of an inventive mind. For which Picasso and the New Guinea face masks are famous, but they were also created a century later. For its time and place, the artistry of the Rockingham carvers is extraordinary and widely recognized among the most inventive of the hundreds of stonecutters who worked in early America. One of the most famous works by the Rockingham carvers was made in 1799 for the Bellows children. It's small, so easily overlooked. They were not Benjamin Bellows' children, but closely related to him. He was the founder of Walpole and the namesake for Bellows Falls. His stone from 1777 is shown in the lower right. The Rockingham carvers served a market that stretched from Cavendish to Chester, Grafton, and Brattleboro. The 13 Park children in Grafton is one of the most famous early New England gravestones. Also in Grafton, another portrait face, this one of Ruth Axtell from 1803. Daniel Weaver and Susanna Leach, both of Rockingham, from 1803. There were half a dozen Rockingham stonecutters working the local slate. Moses Jr. was not the first. The stone marking the graves of 34-year-old Betty Lane and her twins from 1799 speaks volumes and is attributed to Joseph Adams, whose daughter married Moses Wright. This one of Martha Lovell may be the earliest in Rockingham. Joseph Adams' son Sampson produced some of the most exuberant and expressive work. This, marking the grave of Samuel Walker in Rockingham from 1798, is another folk art masterpiece as impressive as anything of its period in a museum of folk art. And this of James Campbell of Rockingham. And here, Hannah Davis and Benjamin Dole, both of Grafton from 1799 and 97. In Rockingham, the Reverend Samuel Whiting's children and Hannah Dunkey of Brattleboro are shown. Timothy Adams, this stone in Cavendish, if this image was painted on a tavern sign, it would be hanging in a museum as a folk art masterpiece. The earliest stonecutter whose work is found in Rockingham is one Jonas Stewart, who had a shop in Claremont, New Hampshire, and did work as early as the 1780s. Stewart's masked angels examples here in Charlestown, New Hampshire, are right up there with Moses Wright and Samson Adams in inventiveness. Visit any museum in the country, you won't find more expressive folk art than this. His work is also well represented in Rockingham. Also work by John and Henry Locke of Deerfield and Brattleboro. These stonecutters each had their own distinctive style. Moses Wright's son, Alpheus, got into the business and developed the unique moon face in a coffin motif with the deceased initials on the coffin. Based in Bellows Falls and in partnership with Abel Burdett, they produced as many as 100 stones of this type. Alpheus got into the business as a teenager, about 1813. His lettering is especially exquisite. History lessons. The Reverend Samuel Whiting and his wife, Mary. Samuel was a member of the Harvard class of 1769. He was ordained as Rockingham's first minister in 1773. So many doors of learning open in discussing 18th century clergy in New England. He was a Great Awakening era clergyman. And of course, the Rockingham Meetinghouse, his house of worship, and pulpit is just like walking through a time tunnel into the 18th century. Another history lesson, Artemus Aldrich was found dead under his grist mill wheel in 1790. What's an elder? Where was the grist mill? Why was such a thing important on the frontier? So many questions and ways to learn and know the times that shaped the place. Amy Kibbe, what can we learn about her? The Kibbes were from Enfield, Connecticut. She died in Rockingham in 1796, aged 98. Could she and her deceased husband, Edward, have migrated there as late as the 1780s? He died in 1784. She was born in the 17th century. Amazing to think of a 90-year-old woman settling the frontier of Vermont. May have followed her children. Couldn't find much, but answers are usually possible. Elias Olcott died in 1794, but not before overseeing the engineering marvel of the first frame bridge across the Connecticut River, connecting Rockingham and Walpole. Surely a bigger story waiting for a good history detective. Lieutenant Ebenezer Fuller is one of the earliest dated stones in Rockingham, one of several Revolutionary War veterans. He died on September 22, 1777, in the middle of the epic Battle of Saratoga. What was so important about that battle? Another case for the history detectives. Frederick Reed was a Freemason, as was George Washington and 14 other U.S. presidents. What's that about? Another case for our student history detectives. Irena Kendall and Quartus Morgan, bursting with the new stylizing of classical Rome. What's that about? Questions, questions. Jonathan Berry was a Revolutionary War vet who lived until 1822, 41 years after the siege of Yorktown. He was born in 1737, lived through every stage of the journey toward independence, long enough to see our country go to war with England a second time in 1812. This is what brings history to life, and through it, a stronger sense of national pride and civic attachment. Local history is living history. The site has just as much history and art from the later 19th century. In fact, there were monument makers like these in Bellows Falls who have not often been studied. Descendants of founding families who lived in different times and had a different style of gravestone, by then mostly in marble imported from western Vermont. These hands pointing to heaven suggest a continuing hope of an afterlife. Strong religiosity in the 1840s and 50s. That was the era of those stones. And then sweet little Blanche with the covers turned down on her empty bed. The early childhood mortality was a big factor in the life of those times. The Olcott family monuments Signed by the Rutland Marble Shop of Brown and Bagley, and what of the books, an alluring artistic detail. Finally, I'd like to wrap up by discussing need. Stewardship and conservation are always a challenge. The town and Rockingham Meetinghouse Association do most of the work caring for this site. Sometimes bad things happen, like this tree devouring the artistic iron fence around the Wright family plot. Lemuel Wright and family are buried here. He was Solomon Wright's son, Moses Wright's nephew, and Alpheus Wright's first cousin. A 90-second video on my YouTube channel makes the case for restoring it. If you'd like to help, email me or Walter Wallace at clg@rockbf.org. Alas, this is what it looked like 15 years ago. And these are examples of ironwork restoration in Chester and Grafton. Skip the color, but aren't these gorgeous? Teaching, learning, and enjoyment. It matters. The whole site does, because these are potentially extraordinary teaching environments and extraordinary attractions for tourism, and another way to grow the community's feeling of attachment to its treasures and heritage. People protect what they love. Hopefully this presentation will inspire folks to visit, explore, and appreciate your very own national treasure. No town in Vermont has a better one.
You know, all the luck here, even if everything is not in perfect shape, you have a national treasure there. And I believe as the local museums continue to build, as the arts community continues to build, you know, we live in an age today, some people can live anywhere. And, you know, I think Bellows Falls has, as I was trying to indicate in the beginning of my presentation, an amazing housing stock. I mean, you walk around. I would love to take an architectural tour of Bellows Falls sometime.
Bill,
Yeah.
we have a few questions in the chat. Could I
Sure.
read them to you?
Sure.
Okay. The first one, could you please talk about the iconography of the images on the stones?
By Moses Wright with the little moon faces. Mostly what we see there are these, what they call soul effigies, you know, these kind of abstract. The reason I showed that picture of Picasso is to, of Picasso portraits, is to show that Picasso did not invent abstract rendering of human facial features. And nobody would mistake one of those moon face heads for actual portrait. It's a symbol, it's a representation. Around that, you will find flowers and vine decorative features.
Do you have a guidebook or map you could recommend if one wanted to tour various historic cemeteries in Vermont?
The best thing in the world is this website called Find a Grave. And you go on Find a Grave and you can click country, state, county, town. And if you go to Rockingham or Chester or anywhere you want to visit, and then you can actually click onto those cemeteries. And if you're interested in early things or a family name, you can search for that. Or you can search by date to see where the earliest things are. And it's a great tool. And during the pandemic, but we'll plan a day ahead on Find a Grave, and we'll find 6 or sometimes as many as 7 cemeteries that are close enough in neighboring towns that we can do a loop in a day. I have an $8 mirror I bought at Walmart, you know, and it's a mirror, and it helps because you can redirect. Getting the photographing and even looking at gravestones and really enjoying it, lighting makes a big difference.
The Vermont Old Cemetery Association, Burial Grounds of Vermont, goes town by town.
Burial Grounds of Vermont, and it's a Vermont Old Cemetery Association. It's findagrave.com, I believe. You've got literally millions of photographs. So not only do you have a list of the cemeteries, but hundreds of thousands of individuals all over the world have taken pictures and uploaded them to this site.
Why are some meeting houses surrounded by cemeteries while others do not have a cemetery? For instance, there is no cemetery next to the Wethersfield Meeting House.
I think most of the time these were separate town functions, and they're the idea that graveyards are associated with churches is kind of a fairy tale. Sometimes they are, but most of the time they are not. And frankly, the meeting house or church might have been in a central location, and some of the graveyards are in funny locations where maybe the land was no good for farming or a house lot, so it was hilly and kind of meandering. And
Like I'm very interested in that symbol of the hand pointing to the sky. I mean, how old is that?
Great question. Generally, that happens in the 1840s, 50s. Like most stylistic features, it is of a time. But the thing that's so amazing to me about Moses Wright, actually, most of his tablets are relatively plain. They'll have a little scalloped edge around the border. But what he does with the moon face is so varied. I mean, the one that I showed in Cavendish, Vermont, looks like it's got a fleur-de-lis growing out of the head of the person. I mean, it's just, and then there's another famous one in Chester that has a round face, a moon face, superimposed on a heart, superimposed on a phoenix bird or eagle. I mean, Samuel Walker in Rockingham, I think one of the most beautiful stones there has this face, the moon face on a raised neck with hair, frizzy hair flying all over the place, and then vines, flowers and vines around the border, and then these amazing roundels, I guess they call them, or mandalas, compass circles. Also in Grafton, the same stonecutter, same artist, produced gravestones with these birds on a branch. The kind of classic folk art. But again, what I love the most about these Rockingham stonecutters is how much variety there is. The stonecutters in Boston seem to crank the stuff out, not mass produced because they didn't, but once they landed on a style they liked, they just repeated it over and over and over again. I think part of the reason rural stonecutters work is more interesting is because they actually didn't get that much business. They maybe in a busy year, Moses Wright might have made 5 gravestones, maybe 6. So every time he went at it, it was like a new adventure. What can I do this time? To me, is an example of an inventive mind, a creative personality doing something they love.
Odd house associated with the Wrights there. Do you know if they ever lived in Upper Bartonsville?
Well, I think they must have. The question of where they got their slate from. They make gravestones in Rockingham because there was a good supply of slate. Grafton has got a lot of soapstone, and of course Rutland has marble. Rockingham, this area has a lot of slate. So where was the quarry? Where did they quarry the material? And my guess, I'm sure the land records, I haven't done that, but if one made the effort, you could find out exactly where Moses, Solomon, Alpheus Wright lived. And my guess, they were all up there in Bartonsville, and it was near the quarry site.
What can we do to make it cool to take care of cemeteries?
Give tours, get the schools to bring their kids there, have special events and programs. To me, the Rockingham Burying Ground is so rich. Historical research takes time and talent. It's not easy always, but if the work was done, one could develop half a dozen different hour-long tours that would have different themes, a different focus, maybe different stones you looked at. And so it's like a museum collection. And that museum collection can be presented, interpreted, explained. And, that's the more you do, the more people, will know and and care. But every time I'm up there, there are people wandering around looking at stuff. And I think that if I say that you've got one of the best early burying grounds in the state of Vermont, 20 other people will argue ours is better. But I don't have a horse in the race. And I really believe that. And I believe that because the Rockingham burying ground and the meeting house are on the same location. There's so much educational potential with a site like that. And again, I worked in the museum business my whole adult life. This is what museums do, but it's the same approach with a burying ground. Think of it as a collection of history and art. How do you interpret it? How do you program it? How do you make it interesting? There is an art to getting the kind of photographs that I showed. If you notice, my photographs are not blurry. They're not. The light is good. The shadows are crisply articulated, and that's not an accident. That happens intentionally because I know how to manipulate light. I know what time of day the lighting will be ideal. But once people figured out how to make good photographs, rubbings, I think, became more trouble than they were worth. But they definitely do damage the stones, and it's not a good thing to do.
Learn about the families that are buried in the grave house, dress in costume, and tell the stories.
Cemetery in Connecticut that does this big event around Halloween, but they have all these actors and people in costumes that do live first-person interpretation. They research the sites, and they sell out. I think these tours are up to 30 people, and they'll sell out 2 a night for 10 nights at $20 a piece. And I think, I tried to point to a couple stones where there were individuals whose stories just leapt out at you, whether it was a Revolutionary War soldiers or a minister, or the poor guy crushed by the grist mill, or the woman, Amy Kibbe, who's 98. What the heck are you doing at 98 in 18th century Vermont? Hell, there's a doctor in the house.
I don't know how she managed to make it to 98. I don't know how people managed to make it to 38 in those days. Has climate change been a cause for concern for the stones? The answer is yes. There's actually a more specific matter that has been a considerable concern here in Vermont, is perhaps a little less worrisome now than it was a generation or so ago, and that's acid rain. Rain caused by power plants in the Midwest, and sulfur dioxide and some things like that, eastward, and causing climate problems. It was a particular problem with the marble stones that are a little more in western Vermont, the Bennington area, than they are here. But it did some terrible damage to stones, and stones that had been preserved well over 200 years or so, were over a couple of decades.
John, it's amazing. As we travel around, sometimes we'll stumble on a cemetery where the marbles are like in perfect condition. And you scratch your head and you think, how's that possible? Because the point you're making is that the acid rain, marble in particular, or Alka-Seltzer, you drop, it's and they just bubble and disintegrate. And the acid rain has that effect on the limestone alkaline base of the marble. It's a pretty scientific basic thing. And so the marbles are affected by acid rain. And the slate, which is beautifully most of what Rockingham is it delaminates. So sometimes the layers will spread apart and will break off.
While we're on difficult things that happen in gravestones, one other thing that is a problem is weed whackers. The person whose job it is to keep the lawn mowed goes out there with a weed whacker and whacks away, and sometimes the stones don't like it very well.
No, look, this is such an important topic, and another thing that we've learned during a year of visiting literally hundreds of cemeteries. How can I put this? People that do landscaping for a business want to sell you a lot of landscaping. Uh, that nobody who's in the business of selling landscaping services will ever recommend you do less, but please do less, because it's just not that important to have your cemetery look like a putting green. But I have seen dozens of cemeteries where it would appear they never cut the grass, don't spend a dime on it. I think they actually look better. Could you get sheep in there? That's probably what they did in the 19th century. We'll be in a cemetery and you see these guys thrashing around on these ride-em mowers. And you know, I don't know if they hit things all the time, but you're gonna damage. I mean, it's good to cut the grass, but contemporary burials, if you just let the grass, I'm not suggesting you let the grass go wild, but I can promise you it doesn't look bad. And there are places, I was astonished at Amherst, Massachusetts, got to their cemetery, and it was obvious they'd made a policy decision not to cut the grass. And I thought that was different. And I didn't mind it really. And of course, it saves money that can be used to do the more important thing, in my opinion, which is the care of the artifacts, the gravestones. If you had $25,000 a year to spend on care and conservation of these historic burying grounds, that would probably be the least that it required to do the job, to get the job done. And I mean, the job's never done, as you've indicated, because things happen. But this is a collection of art and artifacts and history that needs to be cared for if it's going to be preserved. And I think the whole basis of my presentation is the reason to do so is because this stuff is amazing, and promote it a little more. I mean, the Meetinghouse is great, but to promote these is a 2-for-1 experience, which everybody who goes there, they may go see the Rockingham Meetinghouse because they've seen a sign on the highway. Let's pull over, look at that. The minute they get there and they see all this historic cemetery, they start wandering around. And again, I would love to see school groups, a teacher engaged with local history could easily come up with a lesson plan. You know, we're going to bring the kids here and they sit down in front of this one and then that one, and we're going to look at them. We're going to unpack them, explain what you're looking at, try to give them a frame of reference. I mean, I'm obviously a great believer in artifacts, real things, you know, and I think that as a kid, I was inspired by not just reading history in books, but looking at it. And that's what Rockingham Meetinghouse has, such a huge bounty, such a huge, wonderful asset to share.
I would say for our local teachers that many have brought school groups out to the cemetery, but that has to be an ongoing thing.
To remember the bicentennial and all that activity, and there really was a ramp up to the bicentennial, and the federal government had, you know, grants and programs, and communities that had a colonial or Revolutionary War history tried to care for that or promote that a little bit. And I just think that it was sort of in the water of that time. And then suddenly by the 1990s, I realized that maybe there weren't as many young people interested in this stuff as I was when I was 18. Also, because that's what was kind of going on. Historic preservation was coming up. Museums of art, museums of American art, places like Old Deerfield and Sturbridge Village were seeing peak visitation during that period. And but the point is that every town has something of interest, and not every town has something as fascinating as Rockingham Meetinghouse and Burying Ground, but every town has something, and some towns have amazing things, and a few places actually do a lot with what they've got. My wife was a longtime director of a prominent historical society, and she always loved this stuff. Honored the veterans of World War I, you know, 1918, 1919, and so there was a lot of interest in World War I. And she developed a theme tour in the cemetery that happens to be adjoining the historical society where she worked. You could walk from one to the other. She developed a theme tour on World War I, and it was so well crafted and interesting. I mean, she had documents and photographs and material, really told the story of World War I through a series of 10 gravestones that were for veterans or people involved in some capacity. It was fascinating. Yeah, I learned that. I had a teacher at Vermont Academy who did rubbings and taught me to do them. This was in like 1971, 72. But gosh, an exhibit somewhere of high quality 16 by 20 photographs and maybe a few rubbings of some of the stuff in Rockingham, like an exhibit or some photographs, could startle people with how beautiful some of the stuff is.
A number of years ago, when the rubbing thing was still a thing, someone brought a group of Japanese, probably college-age students to the Rockingham Meetinghouse Cemetery as part of a Get Acquainted with America tour.
People wandering around graveyards would have seemed weird, I think. I think it's become much more mainstream. A lot more people do it. I think the culture has changed for better, for worse. And I can well understand that sense of spiritual reverence. But look, I mean, this is a part of reverence. And some of these people, like Captain John Roundy, that gravestone is so famous, or the Park family in Grafton. It's like eternal life. These gravestones are so interesting. People are still talking about these people 200 years later. I mean, I actually learned a fair amount about Captain John Roundy, just dabbling a little bit on the internet. With Amy Kibbe, the paper trail for women tends to be not as abundant as for men. And even most men, you're going to have to really dig around to find anything. It's just, I'm dying to know. 98 years old, dies in Rockingham, 1796. What the heck is the backstory on that? Because it's not just living to 98. It's, how many people lived in Rockingham in 1780? Not many. And so she probably came after 1780, which means she was already 82. And, how many people in their late 80s are thinking of getting on a wagon train and heading out to the frontier? And with the rights, you could say, well, why should the town or private individuals restore their iron fence? And why shouldn't they do it? And part of the answer is, where are they? Are there any people in Rockingham or in the area today that are descendants? There probably might be, but there might not be. And there are lots of places in New England where families that lived in the place for 250 years, long gone. And, just the way it is. So, the care of these things, in my opinion, is really left to the living. Thank you for joining in, and get out there and have a look. Noon is the best time. It's a national treasure, and it's right down the street.